Hi, and welcome to this crash course in preparing for the ASWB exam. In this video, I'm going to walk through some of the basics of what to expect for the Association of Social Work Boards licensing exam, share some of my best study strategies, and also some tips for preparing for the test, day of, and managing any anxiety that you might have for the test. Now, I do have to just give a little disclaimer that I am not affiliated with ASWB. This is just my own advice based on what I've seen and read and my experience as a clinical supervisor, as a social work educator, and as a tutor for these exams. And it's not a guarantee of passing, but I certainly hope that you find it helpful. And then finally, this is a moving target. Things might change, and so you should always check with your local social work licensing board and with ASWB to ensure that any of the specific details are still accurate. But this video and my channel more broadly is my good faith attempt to enhance equity in the outcomes of the exam and help everyone to have a good chance of success, to empower you and equip you to be successful. So the first step is just getting your ducks in a row to sit for the exam. Not just any Joe Schmo on the street can take it, and so this depends about which level you're taking. Bachelor's, master's, advanced generalist, or clinical, and then also your local state or provincial guidelines as far as any paperwork you have to do, at what point in your educational or work process you can sit for the exam. So check that before you are ready to actually sit for the exam. Now, in terms of the exam content areas, I know that this varies a little bit depending on, again, the exam level you're taking, but actually all of the exams, from bachelor's, master's, clinical, and so forth, all cover very similar content with just different focus areas. So they're all going to have some element of human behavior theory, lifespan development, diversity, assessment, intervention, and ethics. My pro tip here is to check out the ASWB KSAs. KSA stands for Knowledge, Skills, and Abilities. So if you just Google ASWB KSAs, you'll see they're called content outlines, and they're specific to each level of the exam. So you can see exactly what the percentage breakdown is for each of these areas and what specific topics within those headers are going to be covered on your exam. Now, it's not a comprehensive it doesn't tell you everything about those topic areas, but it gives you those topic headers so that you have a starting point of what to explore further and identify any gaps in your knowledge. In terms of format, we're going to talk about the format of the test, not the band, the format. So since this is computer-based, it's going to be similar at each level of the exam. So the formatting, if you've already taken, say, a bachelor's or master's and are at the next level, it's going to be similar. So it's computer-based at a testing center, although there is some movement towards piloting some at-home, like lockdown browser options. But at the time of this recording, it's always in a testing center. There are 170 multiple choice questions. 150 of those are actually scored, while the other 20 are not scored. The reason that they have these 20 fake questions is that they are testing them for validity and reliability to include as scored questions in future exams. But I have them listed as mystery questions here because you won't actually know which questions were the fake ones that didn't count. And so my little tip is that if you have a question that really stumps you and you're like, oh my gosh, I am really having a hard time with this, you can just tell yourself that, hey, maybe it's one of those ones that is not even counted, and that may be the case. And you have either 3 or 4 answer choices for each question. You'll have 4 hours to complete it unless you have special testing arrangements due to learning differences or maybe English not being your first language and so forth. And the passing score that you need actually varies depending on which version of the test you get. There's essentially a bank of questions, and they're randomly given, and if you happen to get questions that tend statistically to be easier, you need to get more correct to pass, versus if you end up with a harder version, they offset that by having you need to get fewer correct. So the range is usually between, say, 70% to 60% is a passing score range, but you do find out right away what your score is, so you won't have to wait around and wonder about that. Now, moving on to some of my favorite study tips. You're already obviously taking some of these steps to prepare for the exam, so you're already on the right track. There are prep courses that you might look at. I am offering one through PESI that you can take a look at, but there's many other companies and resources that offer prep classes, and so ask around and see which ones resonate the best with you. I really recommend several free resources as well. So I mentioned those KSAs, content outlines. I also cannot highly recommend the exam guidebook that is through ASWB highly enough. It's really a gold mine. It's over 100 pages. It explains the whole process and how it's set up, along with many practice questions and explanations, and that also can be downloaded for free on the ASWB website. There is an official ASWB study book by Don Apgar. It looks a little something like this, depending on which exam level you're taking. And you can also register for the official ASWB practice exam. I personally really recommend this. I'm not getting any kickbacks or anything here. This is just from my own experience, but it's in the same software format as the real test will be. So it gives you an idea of exactly what it looks like, how you'll navigate from question to question, and it's also going to be the most similar types of questions as you would get in the real exam, because it's written by the same people who write the real exam. And there's, as you've clearly discovered, YouTube channels that offer some helpful, study resources and tips. Various apps might have free questions of the day. And I'll also shamelessly plug that if you enjoy my visuals and study style, I do offer a comprehensive study guide that is specifically geared to visual learners that covers much of the exam content at each level. All right, so assuming you're going to do some practice exams, which I highly recommend, I have a few pieces of advice. So first, the test is a marathon. 4 hours is a long time to be sitting and taking a test. So when you do practice tests, block off 4 hours and try to practice that same thing. It gets you used to the fatigue of 170 dang questions, and that way your results are more accurate. And importantly, make a note of when you actually finish. If you're done in an hour and a half, then it looks like in the real exam you can probably take all the time in the world to re-review your answers. But if it took you close to 4 hours, maybe you do need to be a little bit more decisive, so that'll guide your study strategies. Another tip is that any questions that you're unsure about on a practice exam, you should flag. If it's traditional paper and pencil, maybe circle or highlight it. And if you're taking one of the practice exams, there's usually ways to flag a question and keep them flagged so that you can see how you did on those lower confidence questions. I've found that usually students that I work with, they find that going with their gut tends to be more often than not the best way to go, but you can test this yourself and see what the case is for you for those questions that you're really not too sure about. And then finally, when you take these exams, they'll explain and give some rationale about why the question was correct or incorrect. So focus on your understanding of the reasoning behind the answers rather than that rote memorization. Look deeper than just what the right answer is to find what the right mentality is, what the right key takeaway lesson is. And this will help you in addressing the various scenarios that are presented in the exam, because every scenario is different. Next is to make a plan. This will often ask me, when should I start studying? Are we talking a day before, a week before, a month before, a year before? And it's really hard to say. I will say that your social work education and training is helping you study. So you've already got part of that down. Personally, I would say a couple weeks is the absolute minimum if you have a lot of time to devote every day to go through some of this content. Ideally, I think a few months is good. If you get past 6 or 7 months, I find that folks tend to start losing some of the information, but again, it really depends on the individual. I say start early and study until you feel confident and do well on practice exams. I also recommend allocating more time to areas where you may need additional review. Obviously, if you have gaps, let's focus on those instead of spinning our wheels on things that we already have mastery of. And start with what I call high value studying. In my opinion, 2 of the highest value things you can study are what to do first, the order of operations, and ethics. These are a good bang for your buck, and it helps you with a lot of questions because there's so many scenario-based questions that ask what you would do first. So having a good handle on the steps of the helping process is extremely valuable, as well as ethics being a large part of the exam. And after you master those, you might move on to studying content that's a little bit more specific for recall, things that you might get fewer questions about, like a specific theory or medications and so forth. My next tip is to study what and how. So what is the content, the knowledge, those things that the KSAs cover? And it's high level, 5-minute summary, not all of the details, because it's actually impossible to know it all. You will miss some questions, and that's okay. That's how it's designed to be. But I'm just talking about the basics. You don't have to know absolutely everything about every diagnosis in the DSM. It just might be helpful to know generally what each disorder is about and what they look like. And then looking also at the how. How do you tackle a question in a strategic way? And how do you actually approach it? So I'm going to give you a few how tips here in a moment. First, you want to use guidance you get. So myself and a lot of other folks that help people study might have tips, tricks, memory device, acronyms, mnemonics, and so forth. That can be really helpful, but remember, this is not a math exam. You have to use your own logic and reasoning to select the best answer for that specific question and that specific scenario. So just because the right answer on a practice exam was to refer a client to substance use disorder treatment doesn't mean that every time that's an option, that's going to be the correct answer. Or just because generally we first validate and engage and build rapport doesn't mean that in that specific situation you need to go with safety and refer out first. So hold these guides kind of loosely as a general rule of thumb rather than an absolute no exception, perfect way of approaching a question. Because every question has nuance. So think about in each question, what is the social work role? What is the setting? Who is the client? And other variables in the scenario, rather than getting too hung up on all of those tips and tricks that you learned. So it's a both and, really. So in terms of how to approach those questions, remember that every question stands alone. So there's no pattern. That's not going to be, any mystical answer of like, it's going to be A, and then B. Don't get caught up in if you feel like you're seeing patterns in the answer choices. That's just random and coincidental. I recommend reading the prompt and anticipating the correct answer before you even look. So you might physically cover up those answers or just make an educated guess. If this is a question generally about a biopsychosocial assessment, like thinking through what are some of the elements or whatnot, just having an idea of, okay, here's what it's asking without any options. Here's what I would do in this situation, or here's what I would expect the answer to be. And then you can actually look at the answers, and often there's one that is similar or along the same vein as what you were thinking, and that might be the correct answer. You can also really pick apart the prompt. What is the social worker's role and setting in this case? Who is the client? And what are their goals and needs? What is the question asking? It'll, bold, what is the first thing, for example, or what is the best course of action for the social worker? And from there, you can use process of elimination and make your best guess. There's no wrong, there's no deductions for wrong answers, so the best thing that you can do is guess. You might flag a question and come back to it with a fresh perspective, but doing too much of that, I think, can really bog you down and make you second guess yourself. So if you have a pretty good idea, I would just go for it and leave it. And then finally, it's great when you can use your practice experience or field experience to inform your answers. That's great. But ultimately, the question answers, are very textbook. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We have standards and guidelines that we all follow, and that's what it's measuring, that we know those types of, values and protocols and so forth. But I've seen sometimes people who have a great deal of practical experience in the field actually get tripped up because they start thinking, well, in my agency, I would also need to know this and that and the other. And the prompt didn't answer that. The prompt is going to give you everything that you need to make an informed decision. And if in your practical experience, maybe there's a bit more nuance, as sometimes there is in the real world, try to kind of set that aside when push comes to shove, because there is going to be one best answer based on just the context of that question. Finding support too. We don't want to go through this journey alone. So finding, classmates, colleagues, supervisors, and so forth that can help cheer you on. I find that teaching content is a fantastic way to learn it. So if you can have a buddy, even, your cat, whoever it is that you can explain some of these concepts to, that can be helpful. It also might be really helpful to have that accountability of studying with or having someone checking in on you. Sometimes virtual support like Facebook groups can be helpful, but I will give a word of caution here that they are overrepresented by people who are struggling with the exam. So it might make it seem like everyone and their brother is failing the exam, when in reality, most people are not going onto those groups and boasting, oh, I passed, it was so easy, right? People are going because they need that additional support. And so, don't let that intimidate you if you find that to be the case in any of those groups. Another tip here is when you find a date to take your test, don't tell anybody. That's going to give you so much less pressure. If everyone in your, network is expecting, to celebrate and pass that night, and then you don't, that's so much pressure. So if you want people to be, cheering you on and sending you good thoughts, great, but maybe consider keeping that to a small inner circle so that you can just surprise everyone with the great news that you passed and not have that extra burden of pressure. I also recommend checking out the testing center if you've never been there before. Make a little visit before exam day actually hits, because the last thing you need is to find out that, oh, whoops, it's right next to a railroad track and the train is going to potentially make me late and add to your stress and make you all flustered the day of. Anything that you can do to just make it smooth sailing on the day of your test is a good idea. And I would also say, as you're checking this out, think about things like traffic, time of day, maybe you're better in the morning, and so an early morning test date would work better for you. And if so, what does it look like to get there first thing in the morning? When you're actually at the exam, first, take a breath. Those deep diaphragmatic breaths can be so helpful. Any meditation, mindfulness, grounding techniques I find so powerful. Just noticing the 5 senses, the feeling of sitting on your chair, the feet on the floor, the breeze of any fans in the room, the annoying clickety-clacking of other people in the room and people coughing, that's all part of the experience. And just like noticing and taking a deep breath and being present is going to be really helpful. I think it's incredibly beneficial to do a little brain dump when you first go in there. So you'll have a scratch piece of paper and pencil, and if you have guiding strategies, acronyms, stages of a theory, elements of a diagnosis, or so on, that you just want to get out of your head, go ahead and write those all out on your scratch paper first thing before you even start the test, because this could really free up some cognitive space and reduce anxiety so you can focus on each question and not what you're trying to make sure that you're recalling and remembering. And then pace yourself. This is where some of that preparation, especially taking practice tests, can really come in handy, because you'll know if you're a fast test taker, if you're slow, and you'll be able to measure where you ideally would be and see if you're going too fast and you want to slow down, because sometimes that's an issue. People go too fast and they miss important elements of the question. And on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes people are slow and second guessing themselves, and being more decisive would be beneficial. So find out where you are and then keep track of time accordingly. Check out the rules of the testing center. So can you use the restroom? Can you get up to get water? Sometimes you're allowed to, but the clock doesn't stop. So keeping that in mind if you need to build in breaks. But even just mini mental breaks can be helpful. Just 30 seconds of closing your eyes, rolling your neck, standing up, doing a little stretching, whatever that looks like, can help you to refocus when it's such a long onslaught of question after question. And then finally, as a cognitive therapist, I would be remiss not to encourage you to engage in positive, realistic, and helpful self-talk. Catastrophizing isn't going to help anything, and anxiety and excitement are actually felt very similar physiologically in the body. So I like to, if I feel myself getting nervous or anxious about something, to reframe it as an excitement. So instead of, I'm so worried about how I'm going to do on this dang test, you can tell yourself, I'm so excited to show off my sweet social work skills and all my hard work and knowledge and be done with this thing. And thinking of it as just another chore on your to-do list, like getting groceries or going to the dentist, that you just got to get it done and over with and it'll be okay. That takes some of the fear out of it. So, not if, but when you pass, you'll want to check for local procedures based on where you live, if there's other things that you need to complete or submit, and then wait until your credentials are approved by the board. Sometimes you get a physical license, or some areas have an online system where you can check your status, and then celebrate and do some self-care and enjoy your new status as a licensed social worker, and then check your renewal date and any rules for continuing education so that you never have to take this specific test ever again, knock on wood. In the unlikely event that you don't pass on the first try, and I hope and expect that's not the case for you, but if it is, that won't be the end of your story. The next steps vary by jurisdiction, so often there's a 90-day wait period or a certain number of times that you can take it, but it's not going to be the absolute end of everything. So in summary, if that was all too much and you kind of zoned out, here are some highlights that I want you to take away. Look at those KSAs and the exam guidebook and highlight areas that you might have gaps in your knowledge. And then make a study plan that first focuses on the biggest bang for your buck, high value content areas like the phases of the helping process and ethics. And take practice exams, especially the ASWB, and review not only the correct and incorrect answers, but why and the rationale of the test makers. And I recognize that there can be a lot riding on these test results, from internal pressure to even having a current or future job on the line, not to mention the time and cost that's associated with it. But that being said, this exam is meant to determine your mastery of content, but really it measures how good you are at taking this test. It's not meant to be a measuring stick of your worth or your identity, or even, you know, a determination of how successful you'll be in the social work discipline. So I absolutely empathize with the stress, but also want to remind you that one day at your funeral, nobody's going to be noting your ASWB exam score in your eulogy. You'll be remembered by who you are and, you know, the compassion and connection and competence that you showed with clients after all of this exam stuff is over and done with. I want to just send you some encouragement that you can do this. If you're already listening to this whole video, you obviously are very committed to doing the best you can. So do all of the things that I've recommended, and then know when it's time to stop and just do the dang thing. I didn't make this stuff up. Here are some references and some other forms of guidance that you might seek, but I wish you the best of luck, and if you found this helpful, subscribe and like it and share it and check out my other videos.